So here's something that's gonna sound like a stupid question. Was slavery actually good for the US South, economically speaking? And my first thought was like, what a stupid thing to ask. It's literally free labor. The South was giga rich. I think if you just took it as its own country, it would have been like the fourth richest country at the time. They literally fought a war to keep it. Case closed, right? Except it's not. Not at all. Economists have been debating this for like 70 years at this point. So yeah, it's quite complicated, but it's also really fascinating in a morbid sort of way. So I want to talk about that today. Okay, so I think there's one thing that's pretty clear, and that is if it was good for anyone, then it was good for the slaveholders. And it was good for them. They got really rich. But the interesting thing is that the exact same properties of slavery that made it really profitable and really nice for slave owners ended up doing some pretty significant long-term damage to the US South's economy overall. Now, the people at the time didn't know that because it's not obvious at all to see, but let me explain. Okay, to understand it, we gotta start thinking about production. And the concept is really simple. To produce anything, it doesn't really matter what, you need some sort of inputs. And the two simplest categories of input that we can think of are capital and labor. Capital in this case are things that you invest in, things that you can own. So maybe in the case of a southern farm, it would be a plow. Labor is, well, labor is what you actually use to operate the plow. It's what you use to operate the capital. Now, regardless of whether or not you have heard of these two factors before, you probably intuitively know of some of the properties that they have. So labor is supplied by the workers. Firms can't really just make more of it, they have to pay households to provide it, and they can't own it in the same way that they could, for example, own a machine. Capital, on the other hand, you can own. You can buy it, maybe you can make more of it, you can sell it, and we say it's mobile, and that means you can move it wherever you like. And I want to emphasize that last point because it's going to become important later on. So just remember, most capital you can pretty easily move from one place to another. But there's another property of capital that's going to become important later on. And that is that it's a really good store of value. You can use it to save. Because if you just put your cash under a mattress, it doesn't produce anything, but a machine can. And because it produces something, you can earn a return on it by using it, which makes it really attractive for savings. And so that means when people save, most of the time, it ends up flowing into some kind of capital one way or another. But what's most interesting about this is that even though labor and capital seem like two really clearly distinct things, it's actually really hard to concretely define the difference. Analogy time. Imagine this. Let's say you come into the possession of a robot that's not conscious, but it's a really advanced robot, so it can do all the working tasks that a human can do. And so because you're smart, you rent it out to a factory. The actual tasks that the robot is doing in the factory, maybe it's working the assembly line, are the same work that a human would do there. So we would typically call that labor. But then on the other hand, it's still a robot, so maybe you could buy more, maybe you could make more, you could probably sell it if you find a buyer, and you could definitely move it maybe to a different factory or maybe to a different country altogether. So you see how this kind of blurs the line between labor and capital. Okay, so I guess it's pretty clear where I'm going with this given the topic of this video, but if we replace that robot with a very much conscious human, we get a slave. Remember when I said that being able to move your capital was going to become important? Well, that's because it applied to slaves. So in the Free States, if you wanted to hire labor somewhere remote, maybe you have a farm in the middle of nowhere, you needed to give workers a reason to be in that location in the first place. In practice, that usually meant that you either pay people a lot, so they tolerate living in the middle of nowhere, or if you're really wealthy, you go and build amenities like schools or roads or any public infrastructure really. But in the South, you could just buy slaves and move them to wherever you wanted. And generally, people would move them to wherever the land was most fertile, because that's where the most profitable plantations were, and so you could make the most money of your investment in slaves. And because they could just force the slaves to move there was absolutely no need to make these places even remotely attractive to live in. Okay, so apart from the general moral horror of slavery, that kind of sounds like an economically good deal for the free Southerners, right? Because you get more people working the most productive land, which means your overall economic output will be higher. And that is true. And the South most likely was able to expand westward much quicker than it would have been if there hadn't been slavery. But it's really only one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is that you get a really weird looking population distribution. Like you get no dense urban areas, you get no infrastructure, you get a lack of public schooling. Even the free Southerners, who on average were quite rich compared to the northern counterparts, had a lot less schooling on average. And all these things are really bad long term. And so as a result, the South was constantly losing people. It attracted barely any settlers, and even native-born Southerners generally viewed the North as providing more opportunities, and so even the more prosperous regions of the South were constantly experiencing net negative migration. And I want to dwell on that for a second because I'm not sure people realize how absurd that is. Like, you have a region where the economy is set up to permanently enslave one class of people solely for the benefit for a second class of people. And even that free second class of people looks at that system and goes like, nah, this just isn't working out for us, and leaves. And you might think, maybe they just left because they found it morally problematic, but I mean, these were mostly native-born Southerners, so they were born and raised in that system, so it's pretty likely that most of them were quite used to it and didn't really have a moral problem with it. They just looked at the North and were like, nah, there's way more opportunities up there. And so the economic setup of the South, which kind of kept it rural and undeveloped, doomed it to remain an agrarian society in a world that was increasingly dominated by manufacturing. And this wasn't like clear from the start. Like, the South was looking really strong initially, but it was just not set up well for the long term. Okay, but that's only one side of the issue, because you might say, well, there were plenty of agrarian societies who did manage to transition to a modern economy and stayed relatively wealthy throughout. But remember how I said there was another important property of capital other than it being mobile, and that it's really good for savings? Well, that property also applied to slaves. Because you can own slaves, you can sell slaves, and it's somewhat cynical, but you can make more slaves, as the people of the South demonstrated, and you can rent out your slaves and have them work so you profit from their labor. And so because of these properties, you can save by buying slaves, as disgusting as that sounds. And once again, it's not immediately clear why this would be a problem for the economy, at least it wasn't to me, but once you think about the rest of the economy and what that does to it, it kind of becomes obvious. Because when you can save by buying slaves, you don't need to save by buying other sorts of capital. So in a normal economy, like the North, a farmer with some extra cash might choose to invest that cash into tools. And with these tools, every one of his workers can become more productive. And so the output of the farm rises, but also the output of every worker rises. But in the South, you could just buy more workers. What I'm getting at here is that investment in slaves was competing with other investment in physical capital like tools and machinery. And this wasn't like a small thing. Around 1860, so right before the Civil War, slaves made up about 50% of the entire tangible wealth of the South. To put that into perspective, that is more than all the factories and all the railroads in the entire US combined. Not just the south of the US, also the free states. The slaves were still worth more. Or if you look at the current US and you take the value of every residential building, every house, every apartment complex, everything, and you add it all together, you get roughly 30% of the tangible wealth or so. Like, the capital that was tied up in slaves was much bigger, like much bigger than all the capital today that is tied up in residential buildings. Like 50% is an insane number. And think about what that means for the rest of the economy for a second. Every investment you do requires capital. Every tractor you want to buy requires capital. Every factory you want to build requires capital. Every street you want to pave, capital. Or you have a new invention that could make a production process 5 times cheaper and, make everyone better off with that, requires capital. You have to get it funded. And all of these things that make the economy as a whole more productive, that make everyone better off, were constantly underinvested in because they were constantly competing with slaves, with buying more labor. And so while the North was building industrial cities like Detroit or Chicago or the future financial capital of the world, New York, the South was just building more and more remote plantations. That is not good for your long-term economic development, in case that wasn't clear. Okay, so let's summarize real quick. Slavery gets you a really fast expansion to new fertile farmlands, which is good, but it also gets you a really rural and underdeveloped population structure. And it also meant that every bit of physical capital in your entire region was chronically underinvested in. And together, this really messes up your economic development. But it's kind of a vicious cycle, because for every individual slave owner, it was really profitable. I mean, there was no reason for them to stop. They maximized their profits. They acted rationally in their self-interest. But the thing is, an individual or even a group's economic self-interest is not always what's best for society. And so as a whole, this institution of slavery just ended up producing a system in the South that was much less capable of innovation and growth than the system in the North. Okay, but that kind of naturally leads to a follow-up question. If slavery wasn't good for the South as a whole economically, and it really only was good for the small minority of people that were significant slave owners, why wasn't it abolished naturally without the war? Like, why was it still growing basically until the very end? Okay, well, first off, as I said in the beginning, this really wasn't obvious to anyone back then. I mean, economists were debating this up until very recently. It wasn't obvious to me either until I read the work of said economists. And so the people of the South, they didn't really know or think that slavery was hurting them. Well, the free people of the South. I'm pretty sure it was very obvious to all the slaves that this wasn't a good thing. But they had no political influence, and on the contrary, there was a small but not insignificant group, the slave owners, to which it was extremely clear that slavery was good and beneficial for them. And slave owners as a whole were very rich and, as most elites tend to be, also politically conscious, and they acted as a political class. So maybe the most interesting example of them acting as such is the banning of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. Because you would think that slave owners would be really against the banning of the slave trade, but it turns out that the southern states supported the banning just as strongly as the northern states did. Which sounds insane. The slave owners basically voluntarily cut off their own supply to slaves. Well, international supply at least. But it starts making sense once you consider that at that point they already owned many slaves, and so the slaves were really much more important to them as an asset than they were as an import. Because the ban at this point was basically a protectionist policy for them, because if you can't import any slaves anymore, that means the supply is going down, and if the supply of something is going down, that means the price of said thing must go up. And so after the banning, slaves became more expensive, which is a very good thing if you happen to already own a lot of slaves. And I compared this to a protectionist policy, but there's something else that's quite similar to this in character that if you're politically or economically tuned in, you might be familiar with. And it's NIMBYs. And I know NIMBYs are a dead horse for economists to beat, but I'm gonna do the same because I think it really fits here as a comparison. So if you don't know, NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard, which basically describes people that move into or already live in an area, and as soon as they're there, they really don't want anything else to be built there. Like, they oppose most new developments in their neighborhood. And it makes sense logically, again, out of self-interest, because if it's a desired neighborhood and people want to move there and you restrict the supply of new buildings, the value of the buildings that are already there must go up. And so the people that already live there, they see their real estate, their home values increase, which is good for them. But it's really bad for all the people that would want to move to that neighborhood and now can't. They're priced out of it, or they can't find a place. And so on the net, for all of society, this is a negative thing. And so this is a really tough issue to solve politically, because homeowners are oftentimes some of your strongest voters, and potential future inhabitants, they don't live in your area yet, so they don't have a vote at all. And so no politician has any incentive to ever fix this problem. And so that's something that the NIMBYism problem has in common with the issue of slavery. You have a really large gain to a really powerful and well-informed and connected voter base, and you have a really large and diffuse harm to people that either don't see it, so in this case this is the slave-less free population, or a population that just has no political influence at all, that would be the slaves. And so much like the problem with NIMBYism and zoning laws today, slavery was extremely unlikely to go away on its own. Like, the political incentives, they simply weren't there. And so had the Civil War not happened, slavery likely would have continued to thrive. Okay, but I've strayed from the original question. Was slavery now actually bad for the US South economically as a whole? So the short answer is no, it wasn't beneficial. And the slightly longer answer is beneficial for whom? Like, was it good for the slave owners? Like, yes. Massively. They reaped basically all the benefits. They got massively rich of it, and they were able to cultivate new fertile lands at a scale and in a time frame that they otherwise never could have. So was it good for the entire Free South then? Well, this one is a bit hard to say, because the Free South was relatively wealthy, but I think overall it was probably also a no. The lacking infrastructure, massive inequality, and chronic underinvestment in capital probably meant that if you belonged to the vast majority that didn't own any slaves, you were probably worse off for it. Was it good for the South in the long run? Absolutely not. Because of the lacking capital and lacking infrastructure, the South remained an economic backwater for decades after abolition. And was it good for the South if you actually include the slaves' well-being in the equation? Yeah, absolutely not. I don't think I need to explain this. But I think the broader lesson here is actually this. A thing being profitable or creating a lot of wealth does not mean that said thing is also good for the economy. Like, these can be two completely different things. Oftentimes they are aligned, but not always. And usually the people for whom it is creating a lot of wealth will try to blur the line. So when someone tells you that something is good for the economy, it oftentimes pays to ask, good for whom and at whose expense? Anyway, if you found this interesting, you might be interested in my video about the Roman Empire and why the most powerful European ancient civilization didn't really manage to create any long-lasting economic growth.